Muslims seeking to promote the Qur'an as the word of Allah often bring up the so-called scientific miracles in the Qur'an. They claim that the Qur'an contains descriptions and explanations of natural phenomena which could not have been known when the Qur'an was written. According to them, the Qur'an foretold many scientific discoveries, and modern Western science is only now uncovering what the Qur'an had revealed long ago. Here is a citation from a widely distributed English version of the Qur'an. The Qur'an is not a book of science, philosophy, geology, history, etc. It is a revelation from God as guidance for mankind. However, if experts from any of the human sciences were to read it, they would conclude beyond doubt that the words of the Qur'an are not from any human being, but from God Almighty. The field of science is no different. The Qur'an contains countless scientific facts which were unknown to man even 100 years ago. And considering it was revealed 1400 years ago, clearly absolutely proves its divine origin. Interestingly, the Qur'an itself does not make such a claim, nor have scholars or Quranic commentators of previous generations presented this idea. So where did this concept come from? Dr. Maurice Bucaille was a French scientist who converted to Islam. In 1976, he wrote the book, The Bible, the Qur'an and Science, the Holy Scriptures examined in the light of modern knowledge. It has become the most popular book for Muslims on this topic. In this book, Bucaille attempts to reconcile the Qur'an with modern science, while at the same time pointing out what he considers the inadequacies of the Christian and Jewish scriptures. His was an unusual application of science to a holy scripture, the contribution of modern secular knowledge to a better understanding of certain verses of the Qur'an, which until now have remained enigmatic, if not incomprehensible. He goes on to claim that the Qur'an, while inviting us to cultivate science, itself contains many observations on natural phenomena and includes explanatory details which are seen to be in total agreement with modern scientific data. There is no equal to this in the Judeo-Christian revelation. Here is a video clip of Dr. Bucaille speaking about the reasons for his approach.
There is no human work prior to modern times that contains statements which were equally in advance of the state of knowledge at the time they appeared and which might be compared to the Qur'an. There is perhaps no better illustrations of the close links between Islam and science than the Prophet's hadith. اطلب العلم ولو في الصين. Seek after science even in China, which is a veritable invitation to man to enrich his knowledge. More significant, if it is possible, is the famous hadith, Midadul ulama afdalu min dami shuhada. The scholar's ink is more precious than the martyr's blood. It comes as no surprise, therefore, to learn that religion and science have always been considered to be twin sisters by Islam, and that today, at a time when science has taken such great strides, they still continue to be associated, and furthermore, certain scientific data are used for the better understanding of the Quranic text.
This video actually exposes his unreliable scholarship. Hadiths or traditions are classified according to their reliability. They are sahih or authentic, hasan or good, da'if or weak, or mawdu'a, which means fabricated or forged, and every hadith or tradition is put into one of these four categories. In the video, Bucaille quotes two hadiths or traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And the first one is his saying, "Seek for science or knowledge," it's the same word in Arabic, "as far as China." This is a very well-known and widely quoted hadith, but Muhammad never said it. The famous hadith scholar Sheikh al-Albani says of this hadith in his book Da'if al-Jami', the collection of weak sayings, it is fabricated. The second hadith Bucaille quoted, "The ink of the scholar is holier than the blood of the martyr," is also fake. The website Islam QA states, "The hadith is not sahih," that is, it's not authentic. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi said concerning it, "It is mawdhu'a," that is fabricated. Imam al-Dhahabi said, "Its text is fabricated." Sheikh al-Albani said the same in his As-Silsila al-Dha'ifa, the weak chain. He says, this verdict that it's fabricated is one that one feels comfortable with. So Bucaille begins his reasoning for this approach with two fabricated, two fake or false hadiths. But he admits in his book that many hadiths are of doubtful authenticity, and then he goes on to quote such hadiths as genuine sayings of Muhammad in support of his method. This is a very basic beginner level mistake. Doesn't he know that these are fake sayings of Muhammad? And what other untrustworthy sources has he unwittingly relied upon? His book also makes inaccurate statements. He claims that algebra was an Arabic invention. In fact, the Indian scholar Aryabhata, who died about 500 AD, solved quadratic equations. He's actually accredited with inventing the number 0. Another Indian mathematician, Brahmangupta, who died in 628, again before the Qur'an had been written, calculated the area of a quadrilateral with sides A, B, C and D as the square root of s minus a, s minus b, s minus c, s minus d, where s equals a half of a plus b plus c plus d. And these two examples show that algebra was being used long before Islam was invented. Islam did not invent algebra. Bucaille's exegesis of the Qur'an is also faulty. He claims that there are 4 surahs dating from the period prior to the Hijrah, that is the immigration to Medina, which refer to the writing down of the Qur'an before the Prophet left Mecca in 622. And to prove this, he quotes a mistranslation of Surah 80, verses 11 to 14, referring to leaves of writing held in honor, exalted, purified, in the hands of scribes, in Arabic safara, noble and pious. But when you read most commentators on the Quran, they believe that this verse refers to angels bringing down the revelation from heaven, not human scribes recording it on earth. The tafsir or commentary of Ibn Kathir, one of the most important commentators, says of this verse, in the hands of Safara, Ibn Abbas, Mujahid, Al-Dhahak and Ibn Zayd all said, these are the angels. Al-Bukhari says Safara, ambassadors, refers to the angels. And so Bucaille has missed the point of this verse completely. He then goes on to quote Surah 85:22 about a preserved tablet as proof of the early inscribing of the Qur'an. However, the interpretation of this verse is disputed and unclear. The commentators Jalalain call this a tablet suspended above the 7th heaven. That is, it's a document in heaven. And At-Tustari refers to it as that which is preserved, or mahfuz, in the breast or sadr of the believer. That is, it's a human memory. Neither of these see it as an earthly written text, as Bucaille proposes. Likewise, when he refers to Surah 56:87 of a book well kept, which none but the purified teach, he says teach, the Arabic says touch. Ibn Kathir cites Ibn Abbas saying, It is the book that is in heaven. And he lists 12 or more scholars who claim that the pure ones means the angels. Again, Bucaille finds himself completely out of touch with the classical Islamic commentators. Is he simply inventing his own interpretations of his verses? This isn't a good look at all. Bucaille's approach was then taken up by a Yemeni sheikh, Abdul Majid Az-Zindani, who in 1984 made a short movie called This Is the Truth. He invited some top American and European scholars to an academic conference in Saudi Arabia. During their all-expenses-paid, rather luxurious visit, they were shown verses from the Qur'an which they were told related to their fields of expertise, and then asked if an illiterate 7th century person could have known these without some external input. Az-Zindani then included in his movie quote mind statements from these men, making it appear as if they had agreed that the Qur'an was from God and that Muhammad was a prophet, and it implied that they had all converted to Islam. Several books and tracts on this topic have been written, and they are widely distributed and used for outreach purposes by Muslims for da'wah. And this claim of scientific miracles in the Quran is also used by apologists such as Dr. Zakir Naik, Dr. Shabir Ali, Dr. Yasser Qadhi, Sheikh Yusuf Estes, and Adnan Rashid. These, among many others, cite this idea to prove that the Quran is a divinely inspired book. And so it's an idea which has gained much traction in the Muslim community over the past 50 or so years. A website like the miraclesofthequran.com lists over 100 of these supposed miracles, although Bucaille in his book lists only 32 such discoveries. So let's have a look at some of these so-called scientific miracles. On the whole, the approach takes verses out of context or pushes words beyond their normal meanings in order to make them look like they are supporting current scientific theories. A common one relates to oceanography. There are 3 passages in the Quran which discuss this topic. In Surah 27, he made between the 2 seas a barrier, and the word is hajizan. Another one in Surah 55, he let loose the 2 seas meeting together, and between them is a partition, which is barzakh, which none of them can transgress. And in Surah 25, he has let loose 2 seas, palatable and sweet, and salty and bitter, and he made between them a partition, barzakh, and a barrier, hijzan. So what do these words mean? Well, the word barzakh means an isthmus. It's a narrow piece of land which is present between 2 seas, connecting 2 parts of dry land and keeping the 2 seas apart. And the term isthmus is used in the translation of a very important classical commentary by Ibn Kathir. The most famous isthmuses in the world are at Suez, at Panama, and at Corinth. And the word barzakh is the cartographical term which is applied to this. The other word, hajiz or hijzan, is a barrier, and it's used to refer to a roadblock such as a wooden or steel or stone barrier, or sometimes metaphorically as a language barrier. Now there's 2 possible explanations for these verses. If we look in the classical commentaries, we can see that Ibn Kathir states that there is a barrier of dry land between the fresh water and the salt water which prevents them from reaching each other. So the first explanation of these verses is that fresh and salty water can be found in nature a short distance apart, separated by a land barrier. I lived in the Middle East for many years and I observed this myself. A freshwater spring or an underground well could be found within 50 to 100 metres of the ocean shoreline. and a sand dune or a stretch of flat sand was the only barrier between these. The waters did not mix with each other. Each of them maintained their own levels of salinity, either fresh for the water that was in the well or the spring, or salty for the seawater. And when we camped on the beach, we could get fresh water from a nearby well in the ground. So this wasn't a miracle, it was simply a common phenomenon that any 7th century Arab could have observed. The Bible had described the boundaries of the sea thousands of years before the Qur'an. In the book of Job, it says, God set up the sea behind doors and set its doors and bars in place. And then he said to the sea, this far you may come and no further. This is where your proud waves halt. So that's one explanation, that fresh and seawater can be separated by a physical land barrier. A second possible explanation is the observation that salt water and fresh water do not mix together immediately if they're poured into the one place. The lower salinity of the fresh water causes it to float on top of the salt water, much the same as when you pour cold water onto hot water, the hot water rises to the top. Or when oil and water are mixed, the oil floats to the top, so you get 2 layers. Here's an explanation of this from a Muslim pamphlet on the topic. It says, science has discovered that in places where 2 different seas meet, there is a barrier between them. This barrier divides the 2 seas so that each sea has its own temperature, salinity, and density. For example, Mediterranean seawater is warm, saline, and less dense compared to Atlantic Ocean water. And when the Mediterranean seawater enters the Atlantic over the Gibraltar Sill, it moves several hundred kilometres into the Atlantic at a depth of about 1,000 metres with its own warm, saline, and less dense characteristics. The Mediterranean water stabilises at this depth. And they have this diagram there. You can see the Mediterranean water infusing into the colder Atlantic Ocean water. However, you don't need to send instruments or submarines down 1,000 metres underwater to observe this phenomenon. Bucaille admits, this phenomenon is well known and is often seen whereby the immediate mixing of salty seawater and fresh river water does not occur. In Muhammad's time, it could also be observed. Whenever fresh water flows into the sea, the fresh water floats on top of the salty water for a time until they eventually mix. And every fisherman knows this. It's been observed in the Middle East for centuries, where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea between Jordan and Israel, or where any rainwater from a flash flood runs into the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers run into the Persian Gulf, or where the Nile River runs into the Mediterranean Sea. The fresh water will continue to remain on top. You can scoop down into the sea and get fresh water from the top, near where a river runs into it. I observed this myself in Jordan in 2018 when I was there on a visit. A heavy rainstorm washed a whole lot of mud from the hillsides into the Dead Sea. And as this now brown-coloured fresh water moved into the most saline body of water on earth, that is the Dead Sea, we could see this clear line of demarcation between the fresh rainwater and the salty seawater gradually moving down the Dead Sea. The 2 types of water were not mixing. The fresh water was floating on top of the seawater. However, when we returned the next day, the clear line had disappeared and the fresh and the salty waters were beginning to mix, and eventually they were completely mixed. Now, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located beside the Dead Sea. The Qur'an says of them to its readers, "You pass by them in the morning and at night." So the people who read the Qur'an could actually walk past Sodom and Gomorrah, walk past the Dead Sea. And it says, "And the people of Lot are not far from you," the people who were destroyed at Sodom and Gomorrah. And as a trader, Muhammad would have travelled alongside the Dead Sea, and perhaps he would have seen the same spectacle that I saw during a rainstorm. Fresh water coming down from the hillsides with its different colour, its different density floating on top of the seawater. It didn't need a miracle in order to observe this. It's seen in many places around the Middle East. Here's an interview with William Hay. He's an American professor of oceanography, and he was one of the scientists brought to Saudi Arabia by Sheikh Abdul Majid Zindani, as I mentioned previously. And we see him twice in this video. This is The Truth that was made in 1984, and then we see him later on speaking about it in 2011.
I find it very interesting that this sort of information is in the ancient scriptures of the Holy Qur'an, and I have no way of knowing where they would come from, but I think it is extremely interesting that they are there and that this work is going on to discover the meaning of some of the passages.
On one topic that they wanted me to talk about, which was about internal waves in the ocean. Well, this is a pretty esoteric topic. Actually, there is knowledge of these that goes back a long, long way. The Vikings knew about them and so on. I was asking whether Muhammad had ever been to sea or had been talking to sailors, and I was assured that he had never even seen the sea and never talked to sailors, and he was illiterate and would not have had any knowledge about these sorts of things. So I said, well, you know, if there were no possibility that he had ever heard any of this or this or this or this, then I made the statement, well, then you could say it was information from a divine being, but that would require a lot of proof. You know, you would have to be sure that none of these other things had happened, and there didn't seem to be evidence that one could exclude them from having happened.
So when you were saying, so I noticed the thing with the interview that's being distributed. You're saying that the information in the text presented to you was quite interesting, and that it's good that they're trying to work out the origins of this text. And then the video cuts immediately to a new scene where you say it must be from the divine being. Now, the accounts that I've got, there's one here, which is a Qur'an, which has got claims for scientific miracles in, and you're listed in the back. And it says, for that part, and when he was asked about the source of the Qur'an, he replied, well, I would think it must be the divine being. So are you saying that that is a misrepresentation?
That's a misrepresentation.
Okay.
There's no question about that.
Various exegesis on the Qur'an from different centuries where these miracles are never told. We're not had these miracles described to us in advance of the scientific discovery, but then when the scientific discovery is made, people look back and say, oh, look what the Qur'an clearly said all along.
Most of them are things that I would think that if God wanted somebody to make a great revelation, these are not the things I would have expected, because they're all readily observed. But I would think that anybody who had been to sea, and the Arabs had an enormous 1,000-year history of seamanship, would have had a lot of knowledge about these sorts of things. Certainly in the Bosphorus, and that's where two seas meet, the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. The waters flow out from the Black Sea, and below the outflow is an inflow into the Black Sea. Mm-hmm. And this has been known forever, because when fishing boats go there, the fishing boats would normally drift toward the Sea of Marmara with the outflowing water. But when they lower the nets to the bottom, the fishing boats are dragged backwards in the other direction toward the Black Sea. I think everybody for a long time has realized that there are two sets of waters there, one flowing out, one flowing in, and going in the opposite direction. Any fisherman would have certainly known that. It would have been common knowledge to those people. There's also a possibility, I don't know about the details, but fishermen in the Straits of Bab el-Mandab probably experienced the same thing.
Yeah.
There is inflow at the surface into the Red Sea and an outflow at depth. There would have been the same sort of thing very close to Jeddah.
Yeah.
That would have been noticeable, I think, to any fisherman who used nets to get to the bottom.
Yeah. What do you think was the real purpose of this event?
Well, as I say, we thought it was to help make it easier for scientists to operate in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
But clearly, I think in retrospect, it is to try to recruit people for for Islam. I hate to say it, but under false pretenses.
Yeah.
What Professor Hay said has been the testimony of most of those who were included in the This Is the Truth movie. They said that their words had been taken out of context and they were made to fit the narrative of the movie, which had been predetermined beforehand. So there's two theories about the two waters not mixing together, either that there was a physical land barrier between them, or that fresh water and salt water, when they're mixed together, don't immediately become one. A third claim from some Muslims is that Jacques Cousteau, the famous oceanographer and co-inventor of the scuba diving technology, actually converted to Islam when he heard about these verses from the Qur'an. Unfortunately, this is fake news. Cousteau's family and his organisation have confirmed that he never converted to Islam. When Jacques Cousteau died, he had a Christian funeral and is buried in a Catholic cemetery. This, by the way, is just one of the many Muslim claims that scientists or famous people have embraced Islam after hearing about the scientific miracles in the Qur'an, and these claims are false. A second scientific miracle claimed by Muslims is that of the seven heavens. This concept of there being seven heavens is named at least 9 times in the Qur'an. An example is in Surah 63, verse 7. It says about Allah, He has created the seven heavens, one above the other. The Arabic word is tibaqan, that is literally as stories. And if you look at the Islamic websites on Quranic miracles, you can find drawings illustrating this. When you look at them, you can see the names of the different layers of the atmosphere that you learned at school, the troposphere, the stratosphere, the mesosphere, etc. And it all looks very convincing. But when you look at the details of these drawings, you see some variations. And I've put them here in this table. First of all, you notice that there are not 7 atmospheric layers that are referred to in these websites, but 11. And the first 3 websites choose different combinations of the 11 to make up their list of 7. But no 2 lists agree. And the impression that you would get is that they are simply developing and selecting data, which really exists, which will fit their own agenda, because miraculously, all of them have exactly 7 layers, just as the Qur'an tells them that they have to have. But another 2 websites follow the standard classifications and come up with only 5. It's not clear why they would bother to do this, knowing that this contradicts the Qur'an's number, but at least they are being more scientifically correct. However, it is clear that the 7 heavens concept was not an original one. 1st century BC Jewish scholars had researched the Old Testament and had come up with classifications and their names based on different verses of the Old Testament. And you can see the Jewish list here, and there are 7 heavens. This was 7 centuries before the Qur'an was written. So it was not a new or original idea, and it is definitely not a miracle. A third scientific miracle often cited by Muslims is that of the layers of the earth. In Surah 62 verse 12 it says, "It is Allah who has created 7 heavens," as we just saw before, "and of the earth the like of them." It's not clear what this means. Some Muslims have taken this to mean that just as there are 7 levels of heaven, as we saw before, then there must be 7 levels or layers of earth. Of course, the Qur'an doesn't say that there are 7 layers of the earth. This is merely an inference from the verse. It's not a clear and obvious conclusion from it. And in fact, classically, scholars never agreed with this. Ibn Kathir refers to 7 earths, quoting a hadith from al-Bukhari, rather than 7 layers of earth. And he says, we don't know where the other 6 earths are. Maurice Bucaille denies that there are 7 heavens. He writes, by 7 heavens, what is meant is not 7, but an indefinite number of heavens. For him, the number 7 is purely symbolic. It's not a mathematical or physical reality. But others, and particularly the Quranic Science Miracles group, take it literally and they construct diagrams like this. Again, the data looks convincing. It quotes scientific categories such as the core, the mantle, the asthenosphere and the lithosphere. These look scientific. But when you dig deeper, you find that the 7 layers here do not accord with any other commonly found lists. Here are several other catalogues of the layers of the earth taken from various scientific texts. Notice that they have differing numbers depending on how specifically they want to differentiate between the layers. And so some of them have 4 layers, some have 5, some have 6, some have 8. Miraculously, only the Muslims always come up with 7. And again, they're trimming the data in order to fit in with their predetermined conclusion. This is a common Islamic apologetic tactic, choosing the evidence which will supposedly prove their case and ignoring everything else. A 4th scientific miracle often cited by Muslims is in embryology. This is based on a verse. We, that is Allah, created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him as a drop in a place of settlement, firmly fixed. Then we made the drop into an alaqa, which could mean a leech or a suspended thing or a blood clot. And then we made the alaqa into a madgha, which is a chewed substance. And they claim that this represents the 4 stages of an embryo. Firstly, the implantation of the fertilized ovum is firmly fixed on the uterus wall. Secondly, it grows like a leech, which it resembles, drawing nourishment from the mother. Thirdly, it develops as a suspended thing inside the uterus, resembling a blood clot. And fourthly, the progress of the fetus looks like a piece of chewed gum. Now, there's 2 comments I want to make about this. In the first instance, the Qur'an is not the first ancient writing to propose 4 stages of fetal development. The 2nd century Turkish physician Galen, who lived about 150 AD in Pergamon, Turkey, wrote on fetal development. And he said, "But let us take the account back again to the first conformation of the animal. And in order to make our account orderly and clear, let us divide the creation of the fetus overall into 4 periods of time." Dr. Basim Musallim, who's a Muslim, director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies and the Vice Provost at King's College at the University of Cambridge, concludes, "The stages of development which the Quran and Hadith established for believers agreed perfectly with Galen's scientific account. Hippocrates, Aristotle and Galen were as much a part of Middle Eastern Arabic culture as anything else in it. The view of fetal development in the Quran agreed in detail with Galen's scientific writings." He notes the connection between the writings of 450 years previously and that of the Quran are very much in accord. The Quran doesn't give us anything that is new. The second observation is as people who lived with animals and slaughtered them, it would be commonplace for the Arabs to see the fetuses of unborn camels and of goats and of sheep. As a young man, I worked in an abattoir or a slaughterhouse, and as we were cutting up the carcasses, we often would find fetuses of various stages of development in the cattle and sheep that we had slaughtered. And likewise, when women have miscarriages, they're able to see the fetus that they've passed out in different phases, whether it's an early abortion or a later stillbirth. These are matters of common observation. So we've seen with these 4 claimed miracles, and there are many others, in oceanography, atmospheric studies, geology and embryology, there are some serious problems that have arisen. These include the uncertain meanings of Quranic words, the likelihood of common observation that these things could be seen, the issues of classification, how do you divide things into different groups, a selective use of evidence to reach their predetermined conclusions, a deceptive form of quote mining from world experts to make it appear that they had said things which they later said they had never meant, and a widespread reliance on previous writings. So besides these very practical problems in the application of the Quranic miracles approach, it also raises some serious historical and theological problems. If these phenomena were described in the Quran so long ago, why didn't Muslims discover them themselves and become the current world leaders in science and technology? Why is modern Islamic science so far behind Western science if these things were in their holy book? And if these phenomena were described in the Quran, why did Muslims have to wait 1400 years for non-Muslim scientists to discover them and so explain what their holy book means? Bucaille claims that in former times, man could only distinguish an apparent meaning, which led him to draw the wrong conclusions about the meaning of Quranic verses on account of the inadequacy of his knowledge at the time in question. This is an interesting observation, but couldn't Allah have preserved his followers from wrong conclusions and from error by revealing the scientific facts at the time that the Quran was revealed? Maurice Bucaille says that until Western science made their meanings clear, these verses were incomprehensible. He says, modern scientific knowledge therefore allows us to understand certain verses of the Quran which until now it has been impossible to interpret. But the Quran claims that Allah has made it a clear or mubin book. And he says, we have explained it in detail. So why are Western scientists needing to do now what Allah claimed to have done 1400 years ago? That is, to make the Quran clear. With all of these problems associated with the Quranic miracles methodology, one might wonder where this idea came from and why it arose. It may be a response to the Christian assertion that the Old Testament had predicted the coming of the Messiah centuries previously. In the absence of such clear prophecies about the coming of Muhammad, Muslims may have turned to the natural world to prove the Quran's credentials by claiming that it too contained prophecies, but these were prophecies about scientific phenomena. But it is almost certainly a response to the scientific progress of the West, for which Islam has no parallel. Dr. Muzaffar Iqbal is a Canadian Islamic scholar and the president of the Centre for Islam and Science. He states that late 19th century Muslims created the connection between Islam and modern science in response to Western colonization, and so proving that no disharmony could exist between the work of God and the Word of God. Here is a comment from Dr. Mohammed Gilan, who's a Saudi scientist, on why the scientific miracles in the Quran movement arose.
I think the growth of this movement really has to do with our feeling of defeat as an ummah, that we're not really doing much, we're not producing the scientific advancements and technological advancements that are being done by non-Muslims and in the West especially. So we feel like we have to assert our position with something. We talk about our past 500 years of golden age of Islam, but we don't want to live in the present. And unfortunately, because we're forced to be in the present, we look around, what do we got? Not really much to show. So there's this movement that's grown out and it wants to assert like, look, we're great and we're here and we figured this out 1400 years ago and look at you scientists are just figuring it out now. I think we need to take a look back and step back and reflect upon ourselves, and maybe the time being spent to assert all of these so-called miracles in the Qur'an, maybe we should actually be going to the lab and doing actual science.
Now, some Muslims propose that the Quran actually contains no such scientific predictions. This concept has its Muslim detractors both ancient and modern. The 14th century sociologist Ibn Khaldun was one of the most important Muslim scholars of his time. He decried the value of the physical sciences. He wrote, "The problems of physics are of no interest to us in our religious affairs and in our livelihoods. Therefore, we must leave them alone. Physics must not bother us because it cannot be applied to the two domains that are truly important to us, this life and the life to come." Sheikh Abul A'la Maududi was one of the greatest Muslim thinkers of the 20th century. He said, "As the aim of the Qur'an is to guide man and not teach nature study or history or philosophy or any other science or art, it does not concern itself with these latter subjects." And Dr. Muzaffar Iqbal, quoted earlier, states, "This misconstrued discourse attempts to find evidence of every modern scientific discovery in the Quran to show that the Quran is the word of God because it contains scientific theories and facts which modern science has only recently discovered." This approach is inherently flawed, for it stretches the meanings of the verses to superimpose them on various scientific theories now current, or prove a revealed book through human endeavour which itself remains under constant revision. It amounts to a gross injustice to both the Quran and science. Dr. Iqbal may be seen by some as a liberal Muslim, but at the other end of the political spectrum, Nawab Zada Nabiullah Khan is a spokesman for the fundamentalist group in Pakistan, Jamaat-e-Islami, and he opposes the use of science to authenticate the Quran. He says, "Doubt is sown in the minds of the people on the validity of the Quran as the word of God. More and more we work hard to prove the Quran's scientific correctness. More and more people will get apprehensive of the truth of the Quran. This is an abomination." And more recently, the Muslim apologist Ali Dawa has referred to the Quranic miracles approach as debunked. This is what he says.
Did I leave Islam when this whole scientific miracle thing got debunked? No, I stayed. Now we know that this whole scientific miracles was absolute nonsense. Guess what? Allah led me to Islam. One of the reasons was because of the scientific miracles. And guess what? Did I leave Islam when this whole scientific miracle thing got debunked? No, I stayed. Now we know that this whole scientific miracles was absolute nonsense. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran to the Bedouins. Don't say you have believed, but rather say you have submitted.
His conclusion is supported by the apologist Hamza Tasortis. Here is a 10-minute clip of him totally debunking the scientific miracles in the Quran theory.
The scientific miracles of the Quran claim is usually articulated in the following three ways. Number one, the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, did not have access to the scientific knowledge mentioned in the Quran, therefore it must be from God. Number two, no one at the time of revelation, which was the 7th century, had access to the necessary equipment to understand or verify the scientific knowledge in the Quran, therefore it must be from God. And number three, the Quranic verses were revealed at a time where science was so primitive, no human could have uttered the truths mentioned in the Quran, therefore it's from God. But we have found out now that it's actually an incoherent and not very robust way of showing that the Qur'an is true. The main reason we can't claim miracles, and we're going to discuss many other reasons, is because of the knowledge of what science is as a method and science as a philosophy, meaning the philosophy of science. You see that science is limited.
Yeah.
For example, it's based on induction. Not only on induction, but let's take induction as an example. Induction is a limited thinking process where you have a limited set of observations where you conclude for an unseen next observation or an entire set of observations, known as weak and strong induction. As you can see, that's probabilistic reasoning. It's not going to be 100% certain. It's always going to range from 0% to 99%, because there's always a possibility of a future observation going against your previous conclusions, which were based on previous observations. An easy way of looking at it is using a crude example, using sheep. Say I go to Wales and I want to find out what the colour of sheep are. I count 1,000 sheep, they all happen to be white. So using induction, the next instance of sheep is going to be white. Exactly, but that doesn't mean that's true, because it might be black, and because there are black sheep. So the point is, it just shows that concluding from limited observations doesn't give you certainty. And that's the beauty of science. It's supposed to change based on new observations, new understanding, new discoveries. Now, understanding this about science, we would see that you can't now apply this to the Qur'an and claim miracle. Because you have to show that the science that you think is factual is never going to change. That's absolutely impossible for many things. The philosophers of science and the scientists themselves say that science is revisable. And the other thing that you have to do is that the meaning you've chosen for a particular word in the Qur'an is the meaning intended by God. How do you know? If you don't have any hadith to explain it, you don't have ijma', a consensus to explain these words, then you have to rely on the Arabic language, and you have many layers of meaning for a particular word. That's how rich the Arabic language is. So how do you know this is the meaning that is intended by God?
You're basically digging yourself into a hole as well, because what you're saying is if science changes in 10 years' time regarding a scientific fact which you say is in the Qur'an, then what are you going to do? You're stuck.
Exactly. Imagine the 19th century Muslim use this narrative. The scientific fact of the time was steady state theory, the universe didn't begin. But the Qur'an says the universe began, the cosmos began. So what do? Reject the Qur'an or reject the science? But it's true, it's like Sheikh Akram Nadwi, he says, don't bring things to the Qur'an. Let the Qur'an speak for itself. We superimpose an empirical scientific paradigm with the Qur'an. How do you know it's relating to an empirical paradigm? It could be a spiritual paradigm. It could be an existential one. It could refer to so many different things. Allow the Qur'an to speak for itself.
There is this idea that we have as Muslims that the Prophet ﷺ, he was the first one who mentioned some of these things. This knowledge wasn't present on the face of this earth before the Prophet ﷺ.
That's not true. Let me give you some examples. Consider the setting down of iron. In the Qur'an, in chapter 57, verse 25, the Qur'an says, and we sent down iron. Yes, this is relatively true, that in some meteorites you have iron ore. So iron was sent down from that perspective. Does that mean it's a scientific miracle? No, because you had the ancient Egyptians, 1400 years before the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, they described iron as ba-en-pet, which means iron from heaven. This was like over 1,000 years before the Prophet ﷺ. So you can't claim miraculousness here. We're not saying the Qur'an is wrong. We're not saying the Qur'an borrowed from these civilizations. No. Okay, because the Qur'an uses words that have different layers of meaning that addresses different civilizations, different understandings. Because the whole point of these verses is for them to conclude, for us to conclude that God deserves worship. So he wants a 7th century man to think about space in a 7th century way, to think about nature in a 7th century way, to conclude that God deserves to be worshipped. But the Qur'an is so timeless that it does it in such an amazing way. Oh, another example, sorry, there's more examples. The moon being a broad light. The Qur'an says in chapter 10, verse 5, it is he who made the sun a shining light and a moon a derived light. Nuran means derived light. Now let's ignore how the word shining light and Nuran are interchangeable in the Qur'an. Let's ignore that for a minute. Let's just stick to the topic that some Muslims use this word Nuran to show that the moon doesn't have its own light because it reflects the light of the sun. Because Nuran means like a borrowed light. Yes, that's true. But 500 years BC, 1200 years before the prophethood, before the Quranic revelation, Thales said the moon is light from the sun. Another Greek, Anaxagoras, in around the same period, he asserted the moon doesn't have its own light, but light from the sun. What about, for example, the Big Bang? The Qur'an says in chapter 21, verse 30, have not those who disbelieve known that the heavens and the earth were one piece? Then we parted them. Yes, it's very ambiguous. We don't know the howness and the kind of intricate details. That's not the point of this verse. The point is for us to be in awe and for us to say that God deserves to be worshipped. But this doesn't really refer to the Big Bang, because what Big Bang? There are 20 different models, more than 20 models maybe. The quantum fluctuation model, oscillation model, the Friedmann-Lemaitre model, all these models. What model are we choosing here? And these are not even hardcore facts in science anyway. And not even that, you have Sumerian literature in the Epic of Gilgamesh that reflects this kind of narrative. It says, when the heavens had been separated from the earth, when the earth had been delimited from the heavens, when the fame of mankind had been established. And the Qur'an says, when the heavens and the earth were one piece and we parted them. Similar kind of narrative. Doesn't mean the Qur'an copied, doesn't mean the Qur'an borrowed, but you can't claim miraculousness here because it was already known by primitive civilizations. Does it mean it's wrong? No. But what it does mean though is we shouldn't read too many things into Qur'an, allow the Qur'an to speak for itself.
Okay, so another question that follows on from this is that the Prophet ﷺ, well, there's this idea that's out there that he couldn't have had access to this information from other civilizations. No way he could have had this access. He wasn't learned, he didn't have, he wasn't around other civilizations and so on and so forth. We know this isn't the case. Is that correct?
Yes, the assertion is wrong. They can't claim, oh, even if there was an accurate primitive understanding of science at that time available, the Prophet Muhammad upon him be peace couldn't have access to it at all. Yeah. Again, I'm sorry, this is false. It denies established history of Arabia, and it denies the prophetic traditions are authentic. For example, in Sahih Muslim, which is an authentic compilation of the prophetic traditions, the Prophet Muhammad upon him be peace, he actually took medical knowledge from the Romans and Persians. The Prophet ﷺ said, I intended to prohibit cohabitation with the suckling women, but I considered the Roman and Persians, and I saw that they suckled their children, and this thing, meaning the cohabitation, does not do any harm to them. This is an authentic tradition which shows that the Prophet ﷺ had knowledge of other civilizations, namely the Romans and the Persians. It's highly bizarre for us to make such a claim that he could have access to this knowledge. That's not true. Especially when in Egypt, in around, I think, the 6th century, they already had, in Alexandria, I believe, translations of Greek medical documents. I mean, it's not that far. They went to China, forget Egypt, yeah? Yep. So to make such a claim denies our own Islamic history, and it denies the prophetic traditions. And for example, if you look at the historian Ira M. Lapidus in his book, A History of Islamic Societies, summarizes this. He says, by the mid-6th century, as heir to Petra and Palmyra, Mecca became one of the important caravan cities of the Middle East. The Meccans carried spices, leather, drugs, cloth, and slaves, which had come from Africa or the Far East to Syria, and returned money, weapons, cereals, and wine to Arabia. Because the Quran doesn't have a language that represents a 7th century language. Yeah. It's a language that is timeless. Yes, there may be some things that may be unscientific, but those are things that are only to encourage us to do more science and do more investigation. Because the Quran is not a book of science, it's a book of science. Not there's all these scientific miracles and details. It's not. The verses are quite ambiguous from that perspective. Deliberately to make you think. The Quran wants you to think about the most profound conclusion that he deserves to be worshipped. Not that, you have the embryological process in the Quran. That's not true.
And so to conclude, we have seen that the claim of scientific miracles is a relatively recent phenomenon, beginning in the 19th century as a result of colonization, but particularly coming to head under the work of Dr. Maurice Bucaille. It has developed to the point of Muslims claiming that there are over 100 Quranic miracles in a wide range of fields. However, a closer analysis of these so-called miracles shows that they suffer from serious defects in the way that Arabic words in the Quran are translated, in the data that they select from the scientific world, in the ways that this information is used or misused, by the application of a deceptive use of expert inputs, and the reliance on previous knowledge or noting phenomena that was easily and commonly observed in 7th century Arabia. We also saw that a range of Islamic scholars and apologists have denied the validity of this approach.